Mr. Bryan Rumble, congratulations on your second degree black belt.
Oh, thanks very much.
You just got that not too long ago?
I got it in December of 23. So I did get my black belt in 16, and then in 18 my professor Master Marcus Suarez was in the province at my club. He did a promotion for some of my students, but I wasn't promoted at that date. And then a couple years later, when he wanted to come down in the fall of 2019, he delayed it because just things didn't work out for him. But then when 2020 rolled around early in the year, we were all in the throes of the pandemic. So that was delayed, and then things settled down, but he wasn't really traveling. But he did reach out and he said, I would be happy to promote you. You can just put the stripes on yourself. And that didn't seem right to me. So I wanted him to do it, or I wanted someone of a higher rank than me to do it in his place. So Professor Omar Salvos is in Toronto. I asked if it would be okay with my professor if Omar put this the rank on in his stead, and he said that that would be fine. So I went into Omar's club. So shout out to his club. It's a big, fantastic club, great training there and great people. And I did the class, and then he did promotions for his people, and then he called me up and he promoted me in my instructor's stead, which was nice because it was somebody in the organization. Omar's always been in the organization. He was there longer than I was. I joined that team in 2002.
Mhm.
Omar was already a purple belt, I believe, at the time.
I've got an Omar Salvosa story. So years and years ago, I think I might have been a purple belt and Omar might have been a brown belt. I'm not sure anymore. I was going to go give a seminar or some kind of teach a class at Omar's school. And before I went into the seminar, I went rock climbing with my brother. And I'd never gone rock climbing before. So, I'm getting hoisted up. He's belaying me. I'm climbing. I fall off the wall. He refuses to let me down until I make it to the top multiple times. So I come down and my hands are just limp noodles. I can barely grab the steering wheel of the car. So I go and I teach this, I think it was a seminar. And at the end, people wanted to roll. And I ended up with this rolling against this really tough guy. I want to say his name was Peter. I don't know if he still trains, but I couldn't grip a lapel. I couldn't hold a wrist. I was like fighting with seal flippers, and it ended up becoming this death roll where I was desperately trying to figure out how to finish him. And he was very tough and fighting off his attempts to finish me, but now trying to do it without hands. And yeah, it went on for really quite a long time. I think I ended up winning that roll, but I went and cursed my brother for essentially crippling me before a death roll that I didn't know was going to happen.
Yeah, he was
So
setting you up. I
yeah.
believe that I know who you're talking about. I think that within the organization, it was kind of common for people to recycle belts. So as somebody got a purple belt, their blue belt would be up for grabs, and you could nominate somebody who you wanted your belt to go to. So within my club, one of my students is wearing my brown belt. One of my students wore my old blue belt. Same with my purple, but I got his brown belt when I received my brown belt. It was actually his. I think it's Peter Lee. Is that his name?
Possibly. This was decades ago, and I was more interested in fighting off arm bars and triangles than I was remembering his name. Uh, but that's a really interesting tradition. That's a East Coast Marcus Suarez tradition that I'm unaware of. It's really cool because it creates connections within. It's another way of creating connections within the club, as if trying to choke and strangle each other isn't already the ultimate way to create connections with people.
Yeah, I liked it too. And before I encountered Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I was doing Japanese Jiu-Jitsu at a small club in Woodstock, Ontario. And that was common there as well. When I received my brown belt in that, it came from somebody who had just got their black, Matt Simmons. And we were about the same size. And he asked that his belt go to me, which I think is great because it creates this kind of a shared history within the organization among students over time. So, like all students have stories about their training, but you're making it, it's manifested in a physical object. This belt has a story to tell beyond I wore it and then I hung it on a shelf. It went from this person to me, and after I'm done with it, I want it to go to this person. And I liked that. I appreciated that. And we do that at my club. And since I got Peter's brown belt, it happens among other students as well. So I thought that was really cool.
What was making the transition from Japanese jiu-jitsu to Brazilian jiu-jitsu like? Did you ever manage to pull off any of the Japanese jiu-jitsu techniques in rolling?
Yeah, actually, one of the techniques that I teach today came right out of my Japanese jiu-jitsu training, and it's the entry into a heel hook from if you've been knocked down and your opponent's standing over you. And it's like a leg entanglement, but it works so well. So the Japanese jiu-jitsu style that I trained in was called Koshoru Kempo Jiu-Jitsu. So it was a Hawaiian martial art. It was one of the ones that contributed to Kempo, if you've heard of that. It was like karate, jiu-jitsu, yeah. So there was a style of Japanese jiu-jitsu that came from Okinawa that was called Kempo, not Kenpo, which would have come from one of the main islands. A lot of American, well, martial arts that ended up in America came there via Hawaii. You
Mm.
know, it came in hops. But in
From
Hawaii,
the James Matosi lineage.
yeah, exactly. So from James Matose. So, and he had issues later in life. I believe he died in prison, but he was involved in the early creation of Kempo. And his students, when they got to the US, kept a lot of that philosophy or approach to training. It was kind of like a thing. It was an emergent property happening at the time in martial arts. I believe that Jeet Kune Do came out of the same ethos where we have access to all of this material. So why don't we just come up with something that we can, customize for our needs? So Jeet Kune Do is kind of a response to that. Kempo is definitely a response to that. But it ended up in the US at some point. And as far as Japanese jiu-jitsu styles, it had a lot of grappling. So the curriculum was divided up into 100 core techniques and then, of course, infinite permutations, kind of like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. You could reduce Jijigatami down to it's an arm lock, but I can apply that from so many different positions and angles. They're almost like different techniques. If I showed somebody one at one end of the continuum and then the other, they might not even recognize them as they're both still Jijigatami, right? So out of those 100 techniques, there were 60 striking and 40 grappling. So when I discovered Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu formally, we'd been competing against guys that were doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for a while.
Competing in what context?
So grappling tournaments.
Okay.
In Ontario, we were having these things, this is a little before the rumors that pancration would be, a lot of people call it pancration. I have heard that the true pronunciation is pancration, but, however people say it, I'll not correct because I don't know. But it was rumored to be a potential Olympic event because Athens was coming up and they were like, this is going to be a demonstration sport. So they were organizing all of this amateur pancration in the province. And it was because grappling tournaments were very popular. But when we competed, a lot of the people that were doing BJJ thought that we were judo guys because our grappling was decent. And a lot of people that were doing judo thought we were Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guys because our grappling was, not what you would expect from Japanese Jiu-Jitsu. A lot of Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, it's four corner throw, it's Ikkyo, Nikkyo, Sankyo, the wrist lock combinations at the, your early training. But we were doing Sengaku Jime just like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu people would do it. We were doing Jijigatami, Udigatami. We were doing a lot of that. We had the basic sweeps were the same. So when I transitioned from just strictly doing Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, and I got my black belt in it in 2000, and then I was working at a local university, and somebody that I knew that was a student there that had been doing MMA wanted to start training. So we started training there. And then it was really through his instructor that I started training with Marcus. And when I started doing that and I saw the depth and breadth of the grappling concepts in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I equated it to grad school.
Hmm.
So my undergrad was Japanese jiu-jitsu, and what I did, what I received, I believe I received a solid foundation in martial arts for sure. My instructor was tough. Like he could hit like a tank and he was fast and he had very good technique. But it was mostly striking. And his philosophy was, I'm going to get you to the ground with strikes and then I'm going to finish you
Mhm.
on the ground. But when I got to, the real exposure to Japanese or to Brazilian jiu-jitsu from Japanese, it was like grad school. It was like the depth and breadth of the techniques. So it's not just one arm lock from a couple positions. It's an infinite amount of permutations on this basic concept. So a lot of my teaching now is concept based. So I'll teach a grouping of techniques. And truthfully, I don't really care if they remember them at I mean, I want them to remember.
Sure.
The granularity of the techniques is less important than the concept behind the techniques. If they understand the concept, they'll come up with what I taught that night on their own.
So the word concept is an interesting one because people mean different things by it. Can you give me an example of the last concept that you taught in class?
Sure. So we have just done a long string of techniques around clock choke. So there's how you do a clock choke. You can do it from different positions. You can do it gi no gi. You can do it from the front, from the side. There's lots of different ways you can grip the kimono when you do it. You don't need the far arm sometimes. You don't need the near arm sometimes. But the concepts that I'm teaching are you need to be in this position if you're trying to do this. Your weight has to be distributed like somebody's pinned your body through your chest into their back. You need to do this. You need to do this. And if they get to the position, if they remember those concepts, then everything else should follow logically because you're just trying to get your grips, solidify your position, and then slowly, methodically move into the submission.
This is interesting because your day job is being a scientist. And when you take a look at jujitsu, especially the way it used to be taught, call it in the late 90s and early 2000s, it was a mess. Here's an arm lock, here's a choke, here's this cool variation of a sweep, and blah. Like, here's 1 billion techniques. And then you've seen people struggle to organize it in different ways and trying to bring and it varies from person to person because one person is very positionally oriented, another person is conceptually oriented, another person uses concepts in a different way. So, have you used your scientific background to try and bring order into chaos at all? And if so, how have you done it?
Yeah, I think so. I think I was always that kid. If those school day calendars where you say who your teacher was and who your best friend was and what you wanted to be when you grew up. Mine was always astronaut or scientist. And I was crushed when I was a young teenager. I wrote to NASA and asked what the requirements were to become an astronaut. And one was you needed near 20/20 vision. I had terrible eyes when I was a kid. Laser surgery corrected most of that, but I'm like, okay, I can be a scientist. So I think that some people are trained as scientists because they end up at university and they're interested. But I think I was kind of born one and just figured out that, this is where I can put my natural talents to work best. But I think that the brain that I was born with is good at organizing things, and I have applied the scientific method to learning and teaching. So I break it down. So I'm an epidemiologist. My specialty is evidence based medicine. I write clinical practice guidelines to help clinicians and patients figure out what treatment is best for
On
whatever.
behalf of society, I'm sorry.
Thanks. I've heard that a lot lately. And at one time, before 2020, that wasn't an issue. But yes, much appreciated. I'm a clinical epidemiologist versus a public health epidemiologist. So I'm more trial data versus zombie outbreak. It would be the public health epidemiologists that are, saving the planet from a zombie outbreak. But I've applied the scientific method to how I learn, and it's very evidence based. My first filter is this technique bullshit? And if it's not, it's a viable technique, then the next question is, how does it work? Why does it work? Why does it work so good? Why does it work good in this angle and not that angle? And then after I chew on it for a while, then I start teaching it. And I think that if you don't teach what you're training in, you're missing out on this other level of enlightenment for how the technique works, because I have become so much better at applying jiu-jitsu since I became an instructor, and I've been teaching it for a long time now. But when you have to tell somebody and show somebody that doesn't know how to do it correctly, you get a much deeper understanding of the technique. And then they ask that question that you might not have an answer to. You have to sit back and think. And I try not to do the reflexive answer. If I don't have a good answer, I'll tell you, like, I need to chew on this and I will come back. And sometimes it's that middle of the night eureka moment where you're like, as an example, I have a student that I think is very gifted. His name's Omid, and he's a 4-stripe brown, and he also wrestles. So he's a lot to handle. He's got a huge gas tank. He's never tired. He's got excellent technique, and he's just go, go, go. But I had been doing this chain of techniques around clock choke. The one technique he was doing on his wrestling instructor, and and he's like, I tried to do this to Coach Danny at the wrestling club, and he just laid on his side. So how can I stop him from doing that and make it still work? So I'm like, well, first of all, we have to do it because I want to know exactly what you mean when you say he laid on his side so that I know what to respond to. So he does, and yep, absolutely. He rolled. He just laid on his side right out of the clock choke. It's the one when you can't get their far arm. So you grab their elbow on the near side and drive your elbow down by the side of their head. Works really good if you've broken them down. So I broke them down what I thought would be enough. I go to the inside elbow and start putting my elbow into his neck, and he just laid on his side. So I'm like, okay, this is an interesting puzzle to solve. So I thought about it for a bit, and when he did that, I went over his elbow, hooked it into my leg, pulled my leg back, and that prevented him from laying on his side, and he dropped right into the choke. And I'm like, okay, this works. Let's try this. But I think that this is just an example of how Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a living martial art. It's like a language. You could speak French. There are new words entering French all the time. It's not like Latin, where Latin is locked in time. There's no new words being entered into Latin. There's no equivalent to blog or YouTube in Latin, and there never will be. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is an evolving martial art. Things like DARS, somebody came up with and named it after, the person that did it. So everybody at clubs around the world are chewing on these problems and coming up with new solutions, and that will create this ripple effect as other people at other clubs start coming up with counters, and the art evolves, which is why Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu today, if you look at high-level competition from today, it doesn't look a lot like very high-level competition from the late 90s. The art has evolved.
I really like the analogy of a living language like English or German or French to a dead language like ancient Greek or Latin. And many of the traditional Japanese jiu-jitsu systems would be the Latin, right? Here are the 10 sets of 12 techniques that our founder laid down, and thou shalt not deviate from it. Here is the kata that supposedly some Okinawan dude was doing on the beach 300 years ago. Thou shalt not deviate from it. And entire reason for being is deviation. Let's go back to something. As an epidemiologist, if I come to you and I present you n equals 1, an anecdote, here's what happened to my friend. My friend smoked for 50 years and then died at age 95. Therefore, smoking isn't bad for you. You and I and most intelligent people would reject that because that's n equals 1. Your evidence, that is the weakest, anecdote is the weakest form of evidence. Yet in jiu-jitsu, the evidence, there are different standards for evidence. Can I make some crazy technique work? That's a little bit like n equals 1. And can I make this work on multiple people? That's more than n equals 1. That's more than just one anecdote, but it's multiple anecdotes done by the same person, me. And maybe I'm training with a bunch of uncoordinated white belts who are 50 pounds less than me. So what are the standards for evidence in jiu-jitsu that we have to use to have increasing confidence that some technique or some variation is indeed effective and not just a fluke that worked because of either your unique body structure or the quality of opponent that you're going against in that one particular case?
So I think it's, if I put it in the context of if this was a medical question, it would be worded something like, how would I know that this medication works? Well, if it works in most people, regardless of gender, ethnicity, geographic location, ability to pay, all of those factors that would contribute to the outcome, if it works in most of those cases, then I would say it's a viable thing. So if it was a technique, it would be all things being equal. Generally speaking, if people of similar weight, similar amount of training, similar athleticism, technique ability can make it work on a resisting opponent, then that's probably a viable technique. So, and it's like that. There was not a survey, but just a report done on the winning techniques in UFCs
Mhm.
for submissions. And it wasn't weird things. It was the standards. It was rear naked choke, triangle choke, armbar, Kimura, Americana, heel hook, the things that you would expect, the back to basics, the things that I would consider foundational techniques. So, when somebody starts jujitsu, they might want to learn this sexy position or crazy sweep that they saw on YouTube or somebody pulled off in some big event. But if you want it to work for you as a system of self-defense, the majority of your training needs to be on polishing up those basic techniques so that you can make them work regardless of how big the person is or how aggressive they are or how athletic they are. Because Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, more than any other martial art that I've trained in, and I can't comment on things I've been trained in, but it's really the art of catch and control. The first thing you want to do is immobilize your opponent. The second thing you want to do is control them into a position where you can apply a submission. And that is, a simply stated summary of a lot of things that are going on in the background to get to that point. The years of training, the blood, sweat, and tears on the mat. But really, I want to immobilize my opponent. I want to take them down in a controlled way, and I want to maneuver them into a position that I can finish them with the least amount of damage to me. And that probably means the least amount of damage to them too, because I want to end a fight by putting them to sleep. And they're not harmed, I'm not harmed, and everybody goes home.
Yeah, I think certainly if we're looking at a statistical comparison of high percentage techniques, it does change somewhat if we're including strikes in MMA versus not, and whether we have the gi versus not. Certainly, the back is a dominant position in all three of those modalities, but in MMA, the sheer dominance of the rear naked choke is undisputed. That's always the number one technique. Whereas you don't see that many rear naked chokes in gi competition. It's just a lot harder to get in there. But we do find that the bow and arrow choke is statistically one of the highest percentage finishers.
Right. And kata hajime and okari erijime for the same reasons. So that's single wing and sliding collar choke
Yeah.
for the non-Japanese listeners.
So, I mean, the striking does change it a little bit, but still going for the back and getting to the back and controlling the back and then finishing. Well, now you've got a bifurcation. Now, are you allowed to punch the guy in the head or not? Are you allowed to elbow him in the back of the head or not? Then that does create a decision point at that point. The tree does fork, but still getting to the back is pretty damn dominant. It's nice that multiple rule systems bear that out.
Yeah, for sure.
So we were talking earlier about how how many people in jiu-jitsu play Dungeons and Dragons. I thought this was a really fascinating connection because certainly I did my time. I had AD&D as a kid and figured it out on my own and put my younger brothers through first very half-baked adventures, and it eventually gave it up just for lack of time. But I went through a 6 to 8 year deep dive into that game, and I never connected it to jiu-jitsu before. But you have argued for there actually being a connection. So make that argument.
So Yeah, we were talking about this earlier, but my belief is that martial arts, especially Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, is the adult equivalent. It's the wish fulfillment of the teenage power fantasy that got people interested in D&D in the first place. So when you first start playing D&D or a game like that, doesn't have to be D&D, but if you're young, the one thing that you want is what, well, they could relate if they're playing video games. And as a fun fact, if you play a video game where you're a person playing a fictitious role in a world that doesn't exist, that concept came from Dungeons and Dragons. That was the first game type where you would pretend to be somebody that you're not. So anybody who's playing any video game where you're running a fictitious character in a fictional world, that concept came from D&D. But when you're young and you're playing D&D for the first time, you're obsessed with leveling. I want to get faster. I want to get bigger. I want to get stronger. I want to have better gear. Why do I want this sword? I want a magic sword. So it's a teenage power fantasy. And as that evolves and you get older, I think that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is an accessible adult manifestation of the fulfillment of the power fantasy you had when you were younger. You want to dominate the average person, you want to obliterate them on the mat. Well, here's a tool that you can use to do it. You don't have to roll any dice, you just have to put on a kimono and spend some time in a dojo a few times a week.
And here's your flaming sword. It's called the brand new omoplata entry that you didn't know yesterday.
Right. That's literally it. So acquiring techniques in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is not all that dissimilar to acquiring items in Dungeons and Dragons because you get more powerful and you get more knowledgeable. We're essentially wizards. And in my, Japanese Jiu-Jitsu training, my instructor in Koshoru, and it was all Waza-based training, so they didn't have kata in this type of jiu-jitsu at all. It was just technique based, so waza. But he said that interestingly, waza can also be translated as trick. So you would say, I've picked up a new waza, but it could mean technique or trick, right? So in learning Brazilian jiu-jitsu or any martial art or acquiring any skill, you're basically acquiring something like items for your Dungeons and Dragons character. They're not, weapons equivalent, but it's like it. If you learn a new technique that you're catching people with all the time, it feels like a +1 sword. So I think that that's the connection. There's some little part of everybody that's done both that can probably see the connection. And they're like, yeah, I totally get that. Getting a belt is like leveling up. For example, getting that stripe is like, I'm a quarter the way to my next level.
As you're talking about this, I'm just find myself nodding in agreement because it's so obvious when it gets pointed out to you. I mean, if we want to get if we really start wanting to reach for straws, just because you're a certain level, I don't know, paladin, and you swing a sword at an ogre, it doesn't mean you're going to hit the ogre. It doesn't mean you're going to kill the ogre. There's an element of chance. Just because I've got this brand new rear triangle entry, if you and I are rolling, and I really want to catch you with the rear triangle into a shoulder lock, say, it may work and it may not. It's not like you know how to do the technique and it works. I mean, I would express it as I get on your back and then we roll the dice. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. So there are actually a ridiculous number of parallels.
Yeah, I think that so the way it works in modern games is you get bonuses to your basic attack rolls based on your level. So if you're like a level 12 paladin or something, you were adding plus more than 10 to your roll on a die 20. So even if you roll really badly, like you roll a 12 or a 2, say, a 1 should always miss and a 20 should always hit. That doesn't mean you do huge damage. But I could roll a 2, which is a terrible roll. But when you add my bonus for level, that makes it a hit. So even when I'm, doing poorly, my level, my experience has made me hit when I probably shouldn't. I've made contact. I've got through your armor. You're going to take damage. It was a terrible for a 12th level paladin, still pretty good. So there's a lot of similarities. And when I started in, Japanese jiu-jitsu, half the club came from they were meeting all the time, still playing. The one black belt was, he'd been in this Wraith the Apocalypse game, a World of Darkness game, for like 10 years. And I keep meeting people, because I have the dice tattooed on my forearm here. I don't know if you can see them, but it's a real conversation starter. If I'm doing nogi, I'm wearing a short sleeve rash guard and I'm at some other club or something, or somebody notices it, they'll say, "Oh, you play." It's like it's like thieves' cant. It's that secret signal between thieves where they recognize the symbol that no one else would recognize. But it's a good conversation starter. But a lot of them are martial artists too. There's definitely a connection.
At this point, I'm officially going to warn anyone who's not interested in the topic of D&D to end the podcast. Thank you very much for listening. Come back another time because I'm going to take advantage of this. So I was started D&D in 1972. I was just figuring that out, and continued through till roughly 1978. But there are so many different bloody variations of D&D now that I can't keep track of it. And if I ever get the time to get back into it, I don't know which version I should do. So, like I said, we're going to totally hijack my own podcast, and you're going to explain to me the different variations of D&D and which is the best and why.
Okay. So if you started in 72, it would have been maybe with a precursor, because the game itself wasn't published until 74. They just had their 50th last year. So the original three little books were published in 1974, and that's considered original D&D.
Well, maybe that's it then. Maybe I screwed up on in my
Yeah, there,
mind.
there was a precursor game by the same company called Chainmail. And
No, that was not it. It was definitely the three books.
okay, so they were published in 74.
Okay.
And then the Holmes edition was published in 79, and then around that time the three hardcovers that comprised Advanced D&D came out. So I believe the first one was the
Oh,
Monster
I'm
Manual.
sorry. I'm an idiot. I was born in 1969. There's no way I could have been doing anything in 1972. So, yes, I'm sorry. I think I meant 1980, 1982. That's the era that I started
Oh,
in.
okay.
So,
So AD&D was well in placed at that time. So I started with the purple box, Red Book Basic, what they call Red Book Basic. This was the 1981 Tom Moldvay, David Zeb Cook version of the basic expert rules. And it was more like the original three little books than Advanced D&D. Advanced D&D was kind of created for two reasons. They wanted to make it a competitive game. So if you want to make something competitive, you have to have very granular rules. And two, it was a way to get Dave Arneson off the rule book so they could stop paying him royalties. So it was like a twofer. And in the meantime, they continued to support the game that was kind of like the original three little books. So they did that with the basic expert rules in 81, and then they revised them into what people call the Beckme rules in 1983. So they'd split the two into a group for basic expert companion, masters, and immortals. And immortals was, you were so powerful at that point, you were godlike. So the adventures were basically, you were going around doing god stuff, fighting other gods, because you had transitioned beyond the affairs of mortal men. In the meantime, D&D second edition had come out in the late 80s, and that was really kind of a fix-up. They put in full color art on glossy paper. They kind of fixed up the rules. The one thing that they did was they removed a lot of references to religion. So they would basically did a cut and paste where they got rid of the word religion and replaced it with philosophy. And this was a response to the BADD movement, which was kind of like MAD, so Mothers Against Drunk Drivers,
it was part of the satanic panic in the 80s where
the
people
Satanic
were pretty
Panic.
sure that your kids playing D&D was opening their minds to Satan. I got caught in a little bit of that. I remember my mother being extremely concerned that I was opening my mind to Satan.
Well, that's really unfortunate, and I've heard that. I'm a little older than you, so I kind of avoided all of that, and my parents weren't really religious. I would call myself an atheist today. I think it was, a result of just who I am as a person, but also never had religion pushed on me at all growing up, which I think has a lot to do with, my outcome. But there was something called Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons, BADD, and their mandate was to get it removed from school libraries, bookstores. There was a lot of, activism around that. So they actually removed all the devils and demons weren't in the book. So there was one, they called them by the class. They were still there, but they called them Baylors instead of devils. And they just replaced the names to kind of ease that out. But by the end of the 90s, Magic the Gathering was drinking D&D's milkshake, and money that people would have spent buying hardcover books was going to cardboard crack. It was going to Magic the Gathering. Pokemon was a new thing. Competitive card games were all the rage, and nobody was buying any fiction either. So the company TSR actually had tons of their paperback books, and they were selling more in paperback books. The Dragonlance series, the Forgotten Realms series. I guess one of the bigger American book chains sent millions and millions of dollars of unsold books back. And bookstores take books on prospectus. They don't actually pay for them until they're sold. They just sit on the shelves. And if none are selling, they want that space back. They'll just ship them back to the publisher. And they have to take them because they're just essentially on consignment, right? So that put them in a financial position where they had to find a buyer to acquire them. So they were sold to WotC. Wizards of the Coast, the company that actually published Magic the Gathering, ended up buying TSR in totality, their properties, everything. But what they really wanted was Dungeons and Dragons. Peter Atkinson, the guy that owned WotC, he now owns Gen Con, the convention. He sold WotC to Hasbro a while ago. But I was talking to him at a convention a couple years ago, GaryCon, and, he said that some people weren't happy that he did it. And I'm like, you saved the game, because if you hadn't bought it, it could have been bought by somebody who just parsed it out and sold it for its IP. But he actually loved the game. He came out with a third edition that was completely different. It was done by Monty Cook. They added in skills which changed the game, fundamentally changed the game. And I don't like the skill system, period, but it's a fine game. And then 3.5 came out. Essentially, Pathfinder is based on the 3.5 edition of Dungeons and Dragons. They came out with a fourth edition that was a response to World of Warcraft, because when, just like Magic the Gathering was drinking their milkshake in the late 90s, World of Warcraft and other MMOs were taking the money that would have gone to D&D stuff. So the fourth edition of D&D was a response to MMOs, where your character creation was a lot more like an MMO type character.
When you say
Warriors,
MMO, you mean?
massive multiplayer online role-playing game. So a game like World of Warcraft, EverQuest, Elder Scrolls Online, there's science fiction ones as well. There was a Matrix MMORPG that was hugely popular in the mid-aughts. But World of Warcraft is probably the biggest right now, and will be for the foreseeable future. So that was taking all of the money that would have gone to buying D&D materials again. And fourth was the response to that. So things that they changed in fourth was like warriors could self-heal. They could do like a healing surge. So you didn't necessarily need a cleric or a paladin to do all the healing. Most characters could do something to self-heal, which was very MMO. It made it very dynamic and very tactical. So it played really well on a grid map. And people kind of didn't like it. It didn't really resonate with players. So I think it was a fine game. I beta tested it at one time, and I think it would have been more popular if they'd have called it like D&D Tactics or something, not D&D. But people that played the game were like, that's not my D&D, and many of them went to Pathfinder. And then seeing their market share being gobbled up by Paizo with Pathfinder, they decided that they were going to do a fifth edition. So usually editions hang around for quite a while. Fourth didn't last all that long. Came out in, I'm not sure the exact date, but by 2013, the fifth edition of D&D had come out. And it is once again the world's most popular role-playing game. It's hugely popular. There's web shows like Critical Role that have ensured an audience that had never seen the game before has seen it. It's very, very popular right now. It's more popular than it's ever been. And, kids like me that grew up taking a lot of crap for playing this game that I loved, have been redeemed somewhat. It's cool now. Guys, you can play. It's cool.
So if I was to get back into it, what would you suggest? Version
I would
5?
suggest a rules light version of the game. So if you started in the early days truthfully though, you can play the game you want. If AD&D is the game that you like, you can just play it. You can get the rule books. They're on Drive-Thru RPG. They reissued the hardcovers not that long ago. You can still find them from WotC. But I would recommend a rules light game that is more accessible and plays fast. That is my biggest criticism of modern games, is they take so long to create a character and they take so long to resolve combat. So I'm in a Pathfinder game and I really like the group that I play with. I've been playing with these people for like 20 years, and we started this campaign in the fall of 2019, and we're starting to get to the end of it. Things are ramping up, but sometimes we will spend an hour and a half playing to do just one combat encounter, because everybody has all these abilities, and you can do these combinations where if this character does this, then it allows this other character to do that, and there's just a lot going on.
Mm.
And people aren't really talking as a group on what they should do. It's like a conversation people have between themselves in their own character sheet, where they're just staring at their character sheet and thinking, what can I do here? And where I like the old school gaming approach better. I like rules light, and I like the players as a group to decide what they're going to do, and then they tell me. And I usually am the game master, so I want to make games fast.
Really? Have they changed it from Dungeon Master to Game Master?
So it
Yeah.
depends on the system, because Dungeon Master is actually trademarked by WotC. So if you say Dungeon Master, you're infringing. I mean, I can say it and they're not like, uh, wait for the
Oh,
knock
I
at the
hear a
door,
helicopter. Goodbye. It was nice.
right? Game Master is more universal. So, what do they call in Call of Cthulhu? It's called like a keeper. In Alien, the RPG, you're called the Mother Master after the computer or something. Mother Keeper, Mother Master. I like the term judge because it's the old original term. You were a judge, and
That's coming more from the war games. Yeah.
exactly. So, and these games came right out of Wargaming. You know, there's a guy, his last name, I think his name's John Peterson. He wrote a book called Playing at the World, where he does the history of basically wargaming to RPGs, and he makes all of those connections. But the real origin of the game was somebody was wargaming, and in wargaming, each unit represents some number of units. So it could be 1 to 5, 1 to 10. So it's not a one-to-one relationship. But in Chainmail, the book that I referenced earlier, there was a fantasy supplement at the back of Chainmail. And it was basically because Tolkien paperbacks had hit North America not long before, during like the Cultural Revolution in the US. People had been exposed to The Lord of the Rings, and it was very popular, especially on campuses, which are where these games were being played for the most part. And they put in a fantasy supplement where you could play like a hobbit. So they broke trademark there. They called them halflings in later editions, but they were called hobbits in Chainmail, and they had Balrogs and things like that. But the leap in or just the paradigm shift from wargaming to RPGs was the idea that your unit could be one. Like, you're not representing 5 other people or 10 other people. It's just you alone. So you could be like a fighting man or a whatever, a magic user, and you could just go on an adventure. And that was really the idea that made D&D happen.
You talked a little bit about light rules versus heavy rules. There were 2 space games that I played as well. There was Traveler and there was Space Opera. And Traveler was super simple. Basically, I think there were just 2 6-sided dice and that was it. And you could resolve a combat in 2 minutes.
Yes.
But Space Opera, it was nerd level intricacy. oh, what version of which phaser blaster are you using, and what kind of armor is the person wearing, and how much of the armor was destroyed in the last encounter. And oh my God, it was actually more fun to read the rule book than it was to play the game. I just appreciated the level of detail that went into thinking about the rules. But actually, I'm going to interrupt myself. The rules system at the game that almost nobody remembers was something called the James Bond role-playing system. Did you ever play that?
I didn't play it, but I have seen a lot of it. I was looking at it at a convention not long ago. Somebody had a box set.
The version that I played anyway, I thought it captured the spirit of the movies perfectly. It allowed, you'd have all your rules and you'd have all your mechanics, and then it allowed for that James Bond factor where, of course, it's perfectly normal to, I don't know, be able to deploy your kite surfing kite while riding on a motorbike and take off and land on a train. There were ways to accomplish that. It ultimately wasn't about winning. It was about telling a good story, which, to bring us back to jiu-jitsu a little bit, a great training session isn't necessarily about winning. It could just be about having had some great exchanges and kind of, sort of, telling a great story on the mats.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree with that. I actually think that if you're crushing everybody, every role, you're probably at the wrong gym because it should be more of a give or take. I'm not rolling right now because I have an elbow injury that requires surgery. But when I do, I gauge whether it was a successful night by whether I learned something or whether somebody that I rolled learned something. Because as the instructor, I don't think my role is to crush people. And I try to provide puzzles for them to solve on their own. So if somebody is constantly missing something, I'm going to be doing like the wounded bird, sticking my arm out, like hoping that they take it, that they see it, right? So there's a lot of that. But if I'm rolling with somebody who's always missing this opportunity and they catch it, that's a win for me too, even though, they got the technique, because there's many ways that you could measure success. So as an instructor, I count my students' successes as mine, even like at the club, let alone at competition. I know that a lot of, coaches, if one of their students is on the podium, they're like, that's me up there. I don't mean that. I mean, if I have successfully taught somebody a technique that they couldn't see before, and now they're seeing it consistently and getting it every now and then, that's a win for me as an instructor. It's a win for them as a student, but it's also a win for me as an instructor because learning has taken place. And if my students aren't progressing, I'm a bad instructor. I'm not putting the effort into, I see my role in the lineage as I'm just the caretaker of information that I'm passing on to the next generation. I've received a gift from my instructor, and it's my job to pass that on. His curriculum is what I'm the conduit for. And if I'm doing my job well, my students will be learning and they'll be, acquiring knowledge and doing well in competition and things like that. And if they're not, that's on me.
Well, I can't think of a more fitting ending to the conversation than that, because that's an amazing attitude. How do people train with you? How do people get in touch with you?
So I am at the Rumble Academy. It's in Brantford, Ontario. It's a very small club. I do not teach jiu-jitsu for a living. My day job is a clinical epidemiologist. I'm there Tuesdays, Thursdays. I do one gi class a week. I do one no gi class a week. And then there are open roles organized by my students. And you can find me on Facebook. On Instagram, I'm at Bryan Rumble.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, and good luck with your elbow. Good luck with your training, and good luck with your teaching.
Thanks so much. It was a great conversation. Thanks for the invite.